Sam Goldman, an assistant professor of political science here at the George Washington University and executive director of the Loeb Institute for Religious Freedom. And I am delighted to welcome you to this, our first event of the academic year and fall semester, a debate between John Corvino and Ryan Anderson on religious freedom and discrimination, based on their recent book published by Oxford University Press and co-authored with Sherif Gerges. So if you like what you hear today, you should buy the book and you can find very much more. Some of you may know, but others perhaps do not, that the Loeb Institute was founded last year with an endowment by Ambassador John L. Loeb Jr. with the purpose of promoting religious freedom and civic debate, inspired by George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport in 1790, in which he wrote, among other things, that it is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. And it is in that spirit that I would like to introduce our speakers. First, John Corvino, who is professor of philosophy at Wayne State University in Detroit. He is author of several books, including Debating Same-Sex Marriage with Maggie Gallagher, What's Wrong with Homosexuality, and most recently, the book that I displayed, Debating Religious Liberty and Discrimination. All of these books are published by Oxford University Press. Until 2011, Corvino's column, The Gay Moralist, appeared weekly at 365gay.com. He has also contributed to the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Detroit Free Press, the Advocate, the Huffington Post, the New Republic, Slate, Salon, and Commonweal. And I find here that in the last 25 years, he has spoken at over 250 campuses on issues of sexuality, ethics, and marriage. So we are very pleased to be, if not 251, then maybe 278. The other debater at my right is Ryan Anderson, who is the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation and founder and editor of Public Discourse, the online journal of the Witherspoon Institute of Princeton. He is author of Truth Overruled, The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom, co-author with Sherif Gerges and Robert P. George of What is Marriage? Man and Woman, A Defense, and co-author again of the book that I have displayed. Ryan has appeared on ABC, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, and Fox News. His work has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, and the Harvard Health Policy Review. He is a member of the James Madison Society at Princeton University, and his research has been cited by two Supreme Court justices, Justice Samuel Alito and Justice Clarence Thomas. So these are both heavy hitters who will make their particular cases. So we are borrowing our format from the Lincoln Douglas debates. First, John will speak for 15 minutes, Ryan will then speak for 20 minutes, and then John will conclude with a 5-minute statement, and we will then open the floor for questions. And because we will hold questions until the end, I'll just ask that you not applaud, cheer, hiss, or boo during the prepared remarks. You will have the opportunity to express your opinions and raise your own points of information, clarification, or concern. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speakers. and I will turn over the floor to John Corvino for 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Professor Goldman and the Loeb Institute for inviting me here today, and I want to thank my friend Ryan Anderson for being a part of this event. People are sometimes surprised to hear me refer to Ryan as my friend. They say, how can you, as a gay rights advocate and a gay man yourself, be friends with someone who has fought so strongly against equal marriage rights for same-sex couples? And the answer to that question is really very simple. I drink. No, the answer to that question is complicated, but at least part of the answer is that Ryan and I, while we disagree on some very important things, agree that serious public issues deserve a thoughtful dialogue. And our book was what we hope is a contribution to that kind of ongoing dialogue, and we are very pleased to be part of that with the Loeb Institute, which promotes that sort of dialogue. We got to know each other through the marriage debate in which we were both involved. And I want to begin by noting how this debate is different from that debate and how this book is different from my previous book debating same-sex marriage. Because for that debate, there were two very clear sides. People were either for same-sex marriage or against same-sex marriage. There are a lot of details you can work in there, but at least it lined up pretty neatly on two sides. In this debate, you will be unsurprised to learn that there's not a pro-religious liberty side and an anti-religious liberty side, or a pro-discrimination side and an anti-discrimination side. Instead, what we have are a lot of related and sometimes overlapping questions around the topics of religious liberty and discrimination. And a lot of places where we disagree in part, a lot of places where we agree on certain important things but disagree on other things. And so even though today's debate is taking the form of a Lincoln-Douglas debate, it's not like there's some proposition that I'm going to argue for and that Ryan's going to argue against. Rather, what I want to do is talk about three questions that come up in the book, three general questions. And I'll try to point out some ways in which we differ. These are questions on which we have some serious differences. But there are also points on which we have some agreement, and one of the things I hope you see by the end of this event is the nuance involved in this particular topic, because these are difficult questions on which there are a lot of overlapping possible responses. So, the first question: should religious people play by the same rules as everyone else? I ask this question because there's a worry that what we call religious liberty can sometimes morph into a kind of religious privilege, where religion is used as a sort of get-out-of-the-law-free card, undermining our commitment to equal treatment under the law. Let me talk about the controversial Hobby Lobby case in this regard. Now, many of you may remember this case from 2014. Hobby Lobby is a large corporation employing thousands of employees, and it did not want to provide contraceptives such as the morning after pill because of the owner's religious beliefs, and it filed a claim under RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, suggesting that that part of the Affordable Care Act conflicted with its religious practice. Now, put aside the question of how a company that sells pipe cleaners and popsicle sticks can practice religion. Interesting question, but we're going to put that aside for the moment. Think about what they did here. This is not a question about whether you think the Affordable Care Act is justified or unjustified, whether you like Obamacare or don't like Obamacare. It's a question about whether companies can use religious belief to opt out of certain provisions of that act. And the way they did this in this case is appealing to RFRA, which says that if a particular law burdens a person's practice of religion, the government has to prove that that law is the least restrictive means toward a compelling government interest. And the court said, well, actually, there's a less restrictive means here. The government can pay for these particular contraceptives, or the insurance company can pay. Now, this is true that the government could pay or the insurance company could pay, but just because those entities can pay, it doesn't mean that they will pay. And even though the court said that women will be able to have access to the full range of contraceptives without any additional burden, it didn't quite work out that way. Furthermore, for any particular law that people find burdensome, it's always going to be less restrictive for the government to pick up the cost of it. But how far are we willing to take that? Imagine a Jehovah's Witness who does not want to pay for insurance that includes blood transfusions, because Jehovah's Witnesses do not believe in blood transfusions. Imagine a Scientologist who does not want to pay for insurance that covers certain mental health benefits, because they don't believe, as a matter of religion, in certain kinds of mental health care. This sets, I think, a dangerous precedent. And if we are not willing to grant exemptions in all of those other cases, the worry is that we have religious privilege not just by way of allowing religious people an exemption that non-religious people cannot get, but also by way of favoring certain religions that we are more comfortable with, more familiar with, evangelical Christians as opposed to these other groups. There's also a worry that what's happening here is a kind of end run around a law that some find to be unpopular. And there was a very revealing comment by the president of Eden Foods, which also filed a RFRA claim against the contraceptive mandate. And at one point, the president of Eden Foods said that he didn't care whether the government was requiring him to buy contraceptives or Jack Daniels for his employees. As far as he was concerned, that wasn't the government's business. Now it sounds like it's not really a religious exemption at all, so much as a person who doesn't like having to pay for certain things and is willing to shift that burden to other people, thus poking holes in the law where we end up with this kind of Swiss cheese law. Now, I want to make something clear. It's not that I always oppose religious exemptions. There are a number of places, I discuss them in the book, where I think religious exemptions are both appropriate and desirable. But we have to grapple with what exemptions do, which is to say that certain people do not have to play by the same rules that everyone else does. Second question I want to highlight. How much room should we make for people's conscience claims? Now, you might be inclined to answer, well, as much as possible, but not so fast. The Aztecs, as a matter of religious conscience, used to rip people's hearts out in ritual sacrifice. Do not try this today. Okay, we might say, well, as much as possible without causing harm to other people. Even then, I am not so sure that we should always make room for people's conscience claims. Take the case of Keith Bardwell. Keith Bardwell was a Louisiana Justice of the Peace. And in 2009, it was discovered that he would not do interracial weddings. Now, he claimed he had nothing against black people. In fact, he said that he had, quote, piles and piles of black friends. He actually said this, piles and piles of black friends. He had no problem interacting with black people, welcomed them into his home and so on, but for him, interracial marriage was just a bridge too far, and so what he would do anytime an interracial couple would come to him to get married is he'd step aside and quietly let some other justice of the peace step in. Now, one thing to notice about this case is that the third-party burdens were quite minimal. In fact, far more minimal than in the Kim Davis case. Remember her? She was the Kentucky clerk who did not want to issue marriage licenses and also refused to let her deputy clerks do so because she was against same-sex marriage. She did not want to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples. And you may remember her because she went to jail for a few days because she wouldn't follow a court order, and then there was a big rally, and Mike Huckabee stood up, and they played Eye of the Tiger in the background, and he hailed her as a hero, and so forth. Now, Bardwell, unlike Kim Davis, did not stand in the way. He did not say, I'm not going to let anybody else, other justices of the peace do this. He just stepped aside. Kim Davis actually caused harm for these people. And yet, many people have argued that Kim Davis ought to be given some accommodation. They say, well, look, why can't we just change the licensing procedures so that Kim Davis's name doesn't have to be on the license? I say, okay, but if you're willing to do that, how would you feel about a Bardwell-type clerk who says, look, I can't sign my name or have my name on licenses for interracial weddings. Would you change the licensing procedures for me so that we don't have to have my name on the licenses? Or how about an ultra-conservative Muslim clerk who said, do not want to issue licenses to any women who come in who are not wearing a full burqa? Or how about a Brahmin clerk who says, I do not want to issue licenses for those untouchable Dalits? In all of these cases, we could do the same kind of accommodation that was advocated for Kim Davis. Just we'll accommodate them, we'll take their name off the license. I don't think we should, and I don't think we should because there's an important difference between what those people's conscience tells them to do and what the rest of us ought to do. It may be the case that Bardwell and Davis and all those other people ought not to issue licenses based upon what their conscience tells them. But it does not follow from that the rest of us need to make it any easier for them to have jobs as public officials, given that they do not want to treat people equally and without discrimination. Final question that I want to look at. Should we protect people from sexual orientation discrimination? And if so, how? Now, this is a large and complicated question, and we'd have a lot of back and forth on this in the book. I want to give you just kind of a highlight here. And I want to begin by noting that a lot of the cases you've probably heard about in the news involve wedding providers and cakes and bakers and florists and photographers and so on. And there's something a little bit unfortunate about that, because it makes it seem like the worst problem facing gay people is that we can't buy cakes and flowers. That's not what anti-discrimination law is mainly directed at. It's about employment, and about housing, and about basic goods and services. It's about people like Jack Zawadzki, Jack Zawadzki, an 82-year-old man in Mississippi who earlier this year called a funeral home because his partner of over 50 years was dying. And they called the funeral home in Mississippi and said, look, we have a man dying here. We want to set up funeral services. We'd like cremation and memorial service. Funeral home said, fine. Got closer and closer to the day of the death. They called the funeral home again and said, look, the man's about to die. Funeral home said, no problem. When the time comes, just call, bring him over. And then his partner died, and he brought him over. And at the point at which they were filling out the paperwork, suddenly the funeral director realized that this was a gay man who had been in a same-sex marriage, and he said, I'm sorry, we don't serve your kind here. And at that point, Zawadzki had to go to a funeral home 90 miles away, had to cancel the memorial service at a point when he was grieving for his partner of over 50 years. And that was perfectly legal in Mississippi because Mississippi does not prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Those are the kinds of cases that are particularly important, but it's not as if the cake and flower cases are so simple either. There was a case in New Jersey where a woman spent hours trying on wedding dresses, only to be told when she went to order the wedding dress that, wait, this is for a lesbian wedding? No, you can't have that, after spending hours in the store. There's a birthday cake case, not wedding cake, birthday cake case, where a person ordered a birthday cake. The baker went on the customer's Facebook page, realized that the cake was for her lesbian partner, canceled the order, said, I'm sorry, we don't do cakes for same-sex couples. Now, first of all, who does that? Facebook page? It's like, hi, I'd like to buy some cookies. First, we have to audit your Instagram. No. But second, the logic of this is similar. It says, look, I don't want to participate in this relationship even to the point of giving a birthday gift. And once you take that logic to its natural course, what about if I walk in and try to buy red roses on Valentine's Day? Wait a second, you're John Corvino. I know what you're going to use those roses for. I'm sorry, I don't want to be complicit in that. Or a heart-shaped box of chocolates. So there's a lot of inconsistency here. And I think that we need to be careful about that inconsistency. Inconsistency both with the kinds of things that get included in anti-discrimination law, whether it's race and religion, and then, okay, what about things like veteran status, but all those are fine, but not sexual orientation in the eyes of many people. But also inconsistency in the way in which the people who discuss this invoke the notion of freedom, and this is how I want to conclude. Because I've been doing this long enough and talking about this long enough that I remember when the people who were saying, oh, but we have to protect the baker's freedom, we have to protect the florist's freedom, I remember when these people not only opposed equal marriage rights for same-sex couples, but also endorsed things like sodomy laws, laws that made me a felon in many states, simply because of my personal intimate relationships. And suddenly these very same people are all about, oh, no, we're about freedom. It seems to me what they want is freedom to live their way. It's what we call the Puritan mistake, the idea that religious liberty means liberty to do things the way we do it. And that harms people, and it doesn't just harm people, it tarnishes our nation's great legacy of religious liberty, which at its best is a legacy of inclusion, not discrimination. I think we can do better than that, and I think that this event is a step in that direction, and I appreciate your being here. Thank you very much. Thank you for the suppressed applause. I know he said no applause. You can applaud for Ryan, though. I'm okay with that.
Perfect. Well, great. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, John, for those great introductory remarks. I agree with probably half of what John said, and what I'm going to try to do in the time I have now is to say that what we need the law to be able to do is to draw a distinction between some of the examples John gave, which I imagine everyone in this auditorium is appalled by, and then other cases where we shouldn't have the government punishing people for acting by their convictions. The challenge here is how do we simultaneously craft law and public policy that will prevent real bigotry without labeling reasonable disagreements as if those disagreements are bigotry. The problem with many of the laws that John supports is that they simply say if you disagree about sex reassignment surgery, you're discriminating on the basis of gender identity. If you disagree about the definition of marriage, you're discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation. And so these laws aren't nuanced enough to capture the important distinctions that need to be captured if we're going to have public policy serve the common good, if we're going to respect everyone's human dignity and not commit the Puritan mistake that John rightly calls out. Because what's surprising to me is that someone who has said that those sodomy laws were committing the Puritan mistake by preventing John from living and loving how he wants to, now wants to pass laws that would prevent other people from living and loving how they want to. So it's actually surprising that someone who suffered as a result of people committing the Puritan mistake is now committing the Puritan mistake himself. So let me go through a little bit of what I have prepared here. First, religious liberty is as American as apple pie, but so too is religious persecution. If you think about the history of the American settlers, you have people fleeing religious persecution in Europe. They come to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they come to Rhode Island to set up a safe haven for them to practice their faith their way, and then they start persecuting people who practice their faith a different way. And so what this highlights is two sides of human nature. You can think of the good kind of angelic side from the Looney Tunes cartoon, and then the evil, devilish, demonic side. The good side is that people want to be free to seek out God as they understand who and what God is, whether it's God or the gods, whether it's karma, however they understand ultimate religious truth. People want to be free to do that according to their own convictions. You don't want me telling you how to live your religious life. I don't want you telling me how to live my religious life. None of us want the government, Donald Trump, telling us how to live our religious lives. And so there's a value here of why we protect religious liberty. We want to respect that space for citizens to seek it out and to be able to live it out themselves. But there's also that bad side of human nature, where we want other people to conform to our beliefs. And we want to impose our beliefs on other people. We want to coerce other people to live according to our values. And we want to penalize people who don't live according to our values. That's the Puritan mistake. And unfortunately, what's going on right now is that we have a form of progressive Puritanism, in which progressives have gained the power of the government, and they seek to impose their values on conservatives who are on the losing side of these various battles. So here we have an order of nuns, the Little Sisters of the Poor. About 2% of Americans are opposed to contraception. And these nuns fit into that 2% of Americans who are morally opposed to contraception. And yet the government said that the Little Sisters of the Poor, their health care plan had to cover contraceptives. This is the majority, 98% of Americans, imposing their moral views about contraception on a very insular minority, celibate Roman Catholic nuns. And the Obama administration refused to grant the Little Sisters of the Poor an exemption from this mandate. So it's not good enough that women have a constitutional right to use contraception. It's not good enough that women have government-subsidized contraception. It's not good enough that the vast majority of women would now have their employers providing them with cost-free contraception. The Little Sisters of the Poor also have to do this. And they've spent the past 7 years, and they're still in federal court, suing for their religious freedom to not be complicit in what they view as the evil of contraception. Now, whether you agree or disagree with these Roman Catholic nuns, what justification is there for the government to tell them they have to do it according to the majority values? That's the Puritan mistake. Then, if you're not familiar with another aspect of Obamacare, there was a transgender mandate. In the last year of the Obama administration, the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Justice redefined the word sex to mean gender identity. And they said that because Obamacare prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex, it would now, 7 years later, prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender identity. And so they issued a regulation saying every healthcare plan in the United States regulated by Obamacare would have to pay for sex reassignment surgery and sex reassignment hormones, regardless of either medical objections, religious objections, or conscientious objections. And every relevant physician who specializes in endocrinology or surgery, so if you're a doctor who does hormone therapy for people who have low testosterone or low estrogen, you would now be mandated to do it for sex reassignment purposes, or else you would be guilty of discrimination violating that code of Obamacare. If you're a surgeon who does mastectomies and hysterectomies because of cancer, you would now have to do mastectomies and hysterectomies because of sex reassignment. And if you didn't, you would be guilty of a federal crime, discrimination on the basis of gender identity. That's the Puritan mistake. Rather than saying, look, we have a disagreement about what good health care looks like for gender dysphoria. Some physicians think administering cross-sex hormones is good medicine. Other physicians think mental health care is good medicine. Let's not have the federal government coerce people one way or the other. Let's not have the federal government mandate people practice medicine according to the majority's values one way or the other. Instead, what we had was the Obama administration saying, you're all going to have to do it our way. Thankfully, on New Year's Eve, around 10 o'clock at night, a federal judge, and this was going to go into effect at midnight, a federal judge struck down that provision of Obamacare as being unconstitutional. And then 2 months later, the Trump administration, Department of Justice, and Secretary of Health and Human Services rescinded that guidance. So they're no longer that mandate. So those are two of the religious liberty challenges that came up in the healthcare context. We've also seen this in the charitable context. Catholic Charities has been taking care of widows and orphans longer than the United States of America has existed. But they can no longer take care of orphans in Massachusetts, in Illinois, in San Francisco, or right here in Washington, D.C., because they want to take care of orphans in accordance with what they believe is best for children. They want to find the orphans who've been entrusted to their care a home with a married mom and dad, and the government had says, no, that's discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Catholic Charities responds, no, it's not discrimination. We don't care what the sexual orientation is of the prospective parents. What we care about is that children have both a mom and a dad. We think men and women aren't interchangeable, and that mothers and fathers aren't replaceable, that the two best dads in the world can't replace a missing mom, the two best moms in the world can't replace a missing dad, and we think children deserve both. Now, whether you agree or disagree with Catholic Charities, that belief I just articulated has nothing to do with sexual orientation. They're not saying that gay men can't love kids. They're saying the best two dads, regardless of sexual orientation, can't replace a mom. The best two moms can't replace a dad. So agree or disagree with that charity, they're not discriminating, and they're certainly not discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation. And yet they've been told by the government that they are, and they've been told that they will lose their license to run an adoption agency unless they comply with the law. Now, who does this benefit? This benefits exactly no one. The vast majority of adoptions are performed by government agencies, and government agencies have to do same-sex adoptions. It's a small minority of adoptions that are done by private and faith-based adoption agencies. Why do we need to coerce them or penalize them for acting according to their conscientious beliefs? Catholic Charities had a track record of placing the hardest to place kids into loving, permanent adoptive homes. So chalk this up either to grace or to Catholic guilt. But one way or the other, the Catholic agency was able to get more families to be more generous, to open up their hearts and their homes to more children than the government agencies were able to do. They were able to help women facing unplanned pregnancies to choose life and to place those children up for adoption, to give them a chance at life. And they were able to help families to adopt not just the cute, cuddly babies, where lots of people want to adopt, but to adopt the 10-year-old boys with behavioral problems who've been bouncing around foster home to foster home. Why would anyone in this room want to shut those adoption agencies down? Why would anyone want to force them to either violate their beliefs or cease to serve children? It strikes me that here's an instance in which we can actually say we're going to agree to disagree. If you're in favor of same-sex adoption, you're free to do same-sex adoption. If you're opposed to it, you're free to continue doing adoption the way you always had been doing adoption, seeking out married moms and dads. This is one of those win-win outcomes. Just like in the medical context, if you think sex reassignment surgery is a good idea, you're free to do it in the United States. But if you think it's a bad idea, why have the government coerce or penalize you to do it? Now, how did I get to some of these conclusions? Here I want to step back and say, in between the Puritan mistake at the time of the founding, the time of the colonial founding, let me rephrase that, the time of the settlers, and the Puritan mistake of today, the progressive Puritanism that's going on today, we had a moment where we kind of reached an equilibrium. And Sam mentioned this when he quoted Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island. Because if you think about the experience of the Jewish people throughout their history, their existence, to grossly simplify, it's been one of two conditions. They've either been actively persecuted, as they were throughout much of Europe, or they were begrudgingly tolerated, as they were throughout much of Europe. And they write to Washington and they ask him, what's going to be our status here? Are you guys going to persecute us? Or are you going to tolerate us? And Washington's response is neither. That letter that Sam mentioned, before the part that he read, he says, now it's no longer that toleration is spoken of, as if it's the indulgence of one class of citizen that another gets to enjoy their inherent natural rights. And so what was being recognized at the time of the founding and of the Constitution is that the free exercise of religion isn't religious privilege, it's one of those inherent natural rights that governments exist to protect. And it's meant to protect this whether you're in the majority faith or a minority faith. So whether you're Protestant or Catholic, Jewish or Muslim, Latter-day Saint, it doesn't matter. You should be free to live out your faith according to your convictions, not my convictions, not John's convictions, not the majority's convictions, provided you don't undermine a compelling state interest being pursued in a narrowly tailored way. And that's the legal jargon there. What it suggests is that only for the highest of government purposes, a compelling government interest, being pursued in the least restrictive way possible, can a right like this, the inherent natural right to the free exercise of religion, be overcome. So take the Aztec example that was mentioned. Yes, the government has a compelling state interest in protecting innocent human life. The least restrictive way of doing that is saying no human sacrifice. The problem isn't that too much human sacrifice is a bad thing, it's that any human sacrifice is a bad thing. And so the least restrictive way of achieving that compelling state interest is to ban human sacrifice. It's similar as saying we're going to say that people who don't believe in blood transfusions are free to deny themselves a blood transfusion, but they can't deny their minor children a blood transfusion if it would be life-saving. So when you're under the age of 18, there's a compelling state interest that the state has in protecting the lives of minors, and that can justify overriding parental authority and religious liberty in that case, but it can't justify overriding it for someone over the age of 18. Once you're an adult, you can live your life according to your own lights. Those are the sorts of legal tests that we need here. So let me mention 3 types of harmony, what I think is at stake in this debate, why it matters. First, you can view harmony within the self. This is what John was talking about when he mentioned integrity, when he mentioned conscience. It's good for us to think about what is the right thing to do and then do it. It's bad when we think this is what I should do, but I'm going to do something else instead. So when you praise someone for acting with integrity, for following their conscience, what you're getting that at is that it's good for us to be reflective, critical thinkers about what does justice require of me, to form your conscience and then to follow your conscience, not to flout your conscience. And so that inner form of harmony you could call integrity or conscience. There's also an interpersonal form of harmony. This is where you have the good of friendship, the good of civility. It's good for us to be harmonized with each other. Some of us will be best friends, some of us will kind of be drinking buddies, some of us can at least just have mere civility. And those are good things. Those are better than being in kind of antagonistic relationships, better than being in hurtful relationships. And so there's an interpersonal harmony. And then the last, there's a transcendent form of harmony, a harmony between individuals and the more than human source or sources of meaning and existence, should there be a more than human source or sources of existence. And you can see how harmonizing your life with that God or those gods or whatever it is that is out there is a good thing. It's a good thing to explore the question, is there a God or the gods or some higher force? And if so, how do I harmonize my life with that entity or those entities? And so these 3 forms of harmony, I want to suggest, ground the rights that we discuss in the book, Sharif and I, about the right to the free exercise of religion, that transcendent form of harmony, the rights of conscience, that inner harmony, and then lastly, the rights that exist when it comes to non-discrimination. Because what Sharif and I mentioned is that we're not libertarians. I wrote a dissertation titled Neither Liberal Nor Libertarian. We think there's a presumption of liberty, that people ordinarily should be left free to live according to their own lights, but it's only a presumption, that government can override that presumption when it has just cause. And you can see this when the state has had to say that that interpersonal form of harmony was being undermined when people would act unjustly to discriminate against others, even in private commercial reactions. This is nowhere better illustrated than with the Jim Crow South. Here you had localized monopolies of white business owners refusing to serve black people. John actually used the quote, he says, "I'm sorry we don't serve your kind here." That's what was said about black people in the South. In the example he gave, it was said about someone in a same-sex relationship by the funeral owner. That's the type of discrimination on the basis of fill in the blank, whether it's race or sex or sexual orientation, that these laws were meant to rightly target. And they were meant to be shields, to shield people from that unjust discrimination that prevents them from flourishing. In the context of sexual orientation and gender identity, however, they're now being used as swords. They're being swords not to protect a powerless minority from unjust discrimination, but they're being not as shields to protect them, but as swords to, quote, punish the wicked. That, quote, punish the wicked, comes from Rolling Stone magazine, a profile of Tim Gill, a multimillionaire who has pledged $500 million to passing these sexual orientation and gender identity laws to, quote, punish the wicked. That's what he told the reporter was motivating his financial backing for these laws. And so what does this look like? It would be one thing if there were hospitals that said, because you are transgender, we don't serve your kind here, and so we won't do chemotherapy for your cancer. That would be unjust discrimination on the basis of gender identity, and that shouldn't be tolerated in the United States. But that's not what is happening. Right now, the ACLU is suing 2 Catholic hospitals because they won't do sex reassignment surgery on women who want their uterus removed to become men. That's not discrimination, that's a disagreement about what good medicine looks like. And we're using the law not as a shield to protect transgender people, but as a sword to punish the people who have lost these various debates and to impose upon them a sexual orthodoxy. What we're using the law right now is precisely as Puritans, progressive Puritans, imposing a progressive form of sexual orthodoxy rather than a conservative religious form of Christian orthodoxy that the Puritans imposed. The same thing is true for those adoption agencies. Same thing is true for the baker. The baker at the Supreme Court this term, and I'll finish with this, Jack Phillips, his case will be heard on December 5th, the Tuesday after Thanksgiving. He didn't say to the same-sex couple that sued him, I don't serve your kind here. What he said was, I will sell you any other item in my store, but I can't create you a custom-designed wedding cake. And he said, not because of who you are, but because of who I am. I can't design and then craft a custom wedding cake for a same-sex wedding when I believe that would undermine my convictions of what marriage is and what my duties to God are as I run my business. Jack Phillips, he named his cake shop Masterpiece Cake Shop because he takes Jesus' admonition in the gospel seriously when Jesus said you can't serve two masters, God and mammon. And so he says, I'm trying to serve God with every cake I design. He's turned down requests to do bachelor party cakes, to do Halloween cakes, to do a divorce cake. Someone wanted him to design and create a cake celebrating a divorce, a 3-tiered wedding cake that was then cut in half to symbolize the divorce. He was never sued over any of those decisions to turn down specific events and messages he couldn't celebrate. He was sued in this case. The couple ended up getting their wedding cake less than a mile away for free, and it was designed in a rainbow pattern to precisely show the expressive nature of the cake baking. Why? As far as we know, Jack Phillips is the only baker in the entire state of Colorado who has ever said that he can't do a same-sex wedding cake. Why do we need the government to punish him? For the past 4 years, he's had to stop doing all wedding cakes. He's lost 40% of his income, and he's had to let go 60% of his staff. Why is this how any of us would want the law to handle these questions? Why can't we be more nuanced and draw a line between the type of discrimination John is discussing that should be objected to, and then simple disagreements that are just the bread and butter of American life? We agree to disagree all the time. Thank you.
Oh, go ahead. Plug. I tried. So, like Ryan, I'll say I agree with about 50% of what I just heard. We're going to get a sort of Sorites paradox going, where we each get to half, but we never quite
all the way
meet.
there.
Yeah, we never quite get all the way there. But there is a point of important consensus that I have not noticed before, and I think it's worth highlighting. We both agree that Donald Trump should not tell us how to live our religious lives. So that's an important point of consensus. There's a lot to say here, and I just have 5 minutes. So I'm going to toss out a few things, and I hope more of this comes out in the discussion. First of all, to some extent, I think we're talking past each other. Because a lot of what Ryan said was to talk about the extent to which he thought the government ought and ought not to be regulating certain things. Like he talked about the Obama administration's regulation of various kinds of medical care. And we can have that debate about, to what extent should the government get involved in what constitutes appropriate medical care or doesn't. But that's a separate question from saying the government has these regulations, but if you can produce a religious objection, you can opt out of that. Because then, again, religion starts to look like a get-out-of-the-law-free card, and that's different from the debate about, hey, the government's just going too far here. Second, he talks about the Little Sisters of the Poor. The Little Sisters of the Poor, as a religious order, does not have to provide contraceptives. It's only insofar as they operate schools and other businesses that they're governed by the Affordable Care Act. But even then, they can opt out. How do they do this? By filling out an opt-out form. But they refuse to do even that. And at that point, it becomes very difficult to administer these programs that are part of our living together in a shared world. That particular case went to the Supreme Court, not because there was no way for them to opt out, but because they said, even by signing the opt-out form, I'm going to be complicit. Third, he talks about the Masterpiece case. In the record of that case, what it says is that Jack Phillips said, look, I can't do a wedding cake for you. He didn't say at the time just a custom wedding cake. He said a wedding cake, which meant that the same item that he might have sold to different sex couples, he would not sell to same-sex couples. And this was a violation of Colorado anti-discrimination law. It's interesting to hear Ryan talk about anti-discrimination law as if such law is necessarily an example of the Puritan mistake. Think about this. What do laws do? They regulate and coerce. And if you want to open a business, there are a lot of laws that you have to follow. Nothing to do with anti-discrimination laws. If you want to open a bakery, you cannot operate your bakery in the nude. Government doesn't care whether you are a devout religious nudist, you cannot operate your bakery in the nude. If you open a bakery, you have to carry insurance, even if as a matter of religious belief you think insurance is a form of gambling forbidden by God. If your bakery is of a certain size, you have to provide maternity leave for any employees who get pregnant and want to come back to work, even if you believe as a matter of religious conviction that a woman's place is in the home, taking care of her children and so forth. All of these are examples where the law says, yes, we get that you have your convictions, but we have these regulations for the common good. And yes, Colorado has regulations related to discrimination, not just on the basis of sexual orientation, but race, religion, various other categories. And if you open a bakery, you have to abide by those, but that protects people in both directions. It means that Jack Phillips can't say, no, I won't make a wedding cake for you if you're a same-sex couple. It means that I can't say, Ryan, I'm not going to make a wedding cake for you because, look, you're a conservative Catholic, and once you get married, you're going to start having babies, and there'll be more conservative Catholics in the world, and you guys just give me grief, so no. It protects people in both directions. Next to last thing I want to say, and then I'm going to conclude on a note of common ground once again. Talked about the Catholic Charities case. Now, I actually say in the book that the adoption cases are really hard because, like Ryan, I think it's really important to get kids into good homes, and the more organizations we have doing that, the better. But I think what he doesn't do here is grapple with the hard questions. Because look, Keith Bardwell, the reason he opposed interracial marriage, even though he had piles and piles of black friends, is that he thought it was bad for the kids. He sincerely believed that this would be bad for kids. And, you know, let's suppose he's operating an adoption agency. Why not have more people, including people like Keith Bardwell, getting kids into loving homes? Why not let him live out his convictions, you might say? These are difficult questions, and I'm not saying that sexual orientation discrimination and racial discrimination are exactly the same. I'm saying that you can't simply point to the convictions and then think, well, hey, that's their sincere convictions, there's not a problem here. Finally, that point that I just made about hard questions is, I think, a very important point to keep in mind in all of this, because one of the reasons we did this book, and one of the reasons this book was a challenge, is because there are so many hard questions around these issues. Questions about liberty, about the role of government, about the importance of religious freedom, about getting along together in society. And all too often we see people, even people who pretend to come together at the table, they say, oh, look at me, how open-minded I am, pat themselves on the back. But then they just go back to their talking points, they just go back to their Twitter wars. And one thing we do strongly agree on is that we need something better than that. So I want to conclude by thanking Ryan and thanking all of you, because I think this kind of event is an opportunity for us to have something better for that. And we look forward to your questions in the discussion. Thank you.
And now I'll invite you to join me in thanking both debaters. And we will turn now to questions. I have just two brief instructions before opening the floor. First, if you look at the desk in front of you, you will see that there is a microphone, and on the microphone there is an on button. When I call on you to ask your question, please push the on button before speaking so that you will be heard not only by us but also by everyone else in the room. Second, I'd just like to ask you to identify yourselves before posing your question. Give your name, say whether you are a GW undergraduate, grad student, or someone else as may be, because that way we know who you are as well as you knowing who we are. So with that, I'll open the floor. I'd like this first question to come from an undergraduate. So yes, in the back, please.
Can you hear me? Great. Hi, I'm Ian. I'm a freshman here at GW. You both kind of alluded you'd be opposed to this, but just kind of as a hypothetical example, I kind of want to hear what your arguments would be against a hypothetical total liberalization of conscientious objection, be it business or otherwise, where if someone doesn't want to, for say, give their property, their good or service to a customer for any reason, they have signs that say, we reserve the right to refuse business to anyone in plenty of businesses. What would be your arguments against the idea of just let everybody kind of sell or not sell to whoever they want for whatever reason they want, and if someone is unhappy with the way a business is doing, they can choose to boycott that business and call that business out and go somewhere else that does do what they want?
Yeah, so you're asking us why we're not going full libertarian on this, and we have friends here in D.C. who have asked us the same questions, like, why are you so against freedom, both of you? There's an historical reason and a principal reason, and I think this is where we probably, and you can speak after, we probably agree on why not to go libertarian. We disagree on what ought to be included in anti-discrimination law. The historical reason is that just sort of letting the market work it out doesn't work in markets where there's widespread discrimination. It didn't work in the Old South. It didn't serve the common good, and that brings us to the principal reason, is that yes, freedom is an important value, but there are other values as well, and when we think about the common good, those values need to be part of that discussion. I'll let you elaborate.
Yeah, I mean, I actually agree with 100% of what John just said. We not just a 50%, we actually reached entire consensus.
Let's go to dinner. Okay.
You can have market failure. It is, if you're more of an economist way of thinking about it, and market failure can be kind of an environmental failure, it can be one of it can be a social failure, in which markets are actually rewarding discrimination. And so you can see this in the South. If you wanted to run an integrated business, that might have actually hurt your business. You would be boycotted because you respected racial equality. And if you had localized monopolies of white supremacists who were running their businesses according to those principles, and customers who wanted them to be running according to those principles, running an integrated business might have actually been costly. And so there was a justification here for the state to come in, partly because it wasn't just that African Americans couldn't get wedding cakes, or they were locked out of entire markets, and in employment context, locked out of entire professions. You couldn't become a law partner at many of the major firms. You couldn't attend the Ivy League universities, right? These are the sorts of things that were there, and markets alone weren't going to undo it. The question now is, which categories should be on that list for which reasons and what context? That's where John and I disagree, and you heard some of that disagreement.
Back. I think I almost called on you before, so I'd like to give you a chance to ask a question.
Hi, my name is Ian. I'm an undergraduate here at GW. I was kind of curious as to what your thoughts are on one case that came to the Supreme Court a couple years ago. It's been mostly deemed the peyote case, and like what your thoughts on that are. Do you think the court got it right or wrong, or what are your opinions on that?
So this is the 1990 Smith case, which we talk about in the introduction to the book. One of the things we noticed as we were working on the book is that we initially wrote our respective sections, and we both started with pretty much the same history. Like, why don't we all put that together in a shared introduction? And in that case, a Native American had lost his job and was denied unemployment benefits because he had tested positive for mescaline, which is part of peyote, the cactus that he had ingested as part of his Native American rituals. And he was denied unemployment benefits in Oregon, and This case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and what the Supreme Court said is, look, whatever you think about the wisdom of having these laws in the first place, the fact is that you broke the law. This was not a law targeted at Native Americans. This was a law that, a drug law for the common good, and you broke that law. And so in a decision written by that great enemy of religious freedom, Antonin Scalia, it said, look, it quoted an earlier case, the polygamy case, the Reynolds case, to allow this person to opt out would make every person a law unto themselves, essentially. My view is that in many ways Scalia got it right. I think we'd be better off doing what eventually happened immediately after, or very shortly after, which is that Oregon said, you know what, we can make an exception in our law for Native American rituals, why don't we? Just like we had an exception during Prohibition for sacramental wine, this is very similar, why don't we do that? So that it wouldn't be against the law, at least in this particular case. And I'd rather go that direction than say, okay, we can, keep carving out these religious exceptions and do it judicially rather than have it already written into the law so it's clear for everyone.
So I agree with everything John just said there, but I want to highlight an interesting inconsistency in what John has said. Because he just said it was good that these religious objectors to the peyote law were given an exemption so they could practice their faith. But he said when I was discussing that in the case of the Little Sisters of the Poor or Hobby Lobby or the people who object to the transgender mandate, that this was relitigating Obamacare. But you have to look at both sides, because the ability to have a religious exemption is going to be inversely proportionate to the justification of the law in the first place. Because the justification for our homicide laws are so high, the ability to grant religious liberty exemptions are rather low. The Aztecs don't get them. Because the justification for laws banning alcohol aren't that high, it was easy to grant an exemption to Catholics for sacramental wine for communion. Because the peyote laws are somewhere in the middle, it's easy to grant an exemption for Native Americans who need peyote ingestion for religious purposes. The question now is, where do contraception mandates fall in that spectrum? Are they like homicide laws that if we granted the nuns their exemption, the sky would fall? Or are they more like prohibition of alcohol? Can we both achieve the purpose of whatever the contraception mandate is meant to achieve and protect the Little Sisters of the Poor religious liberty? Because both of those things, presumably, are part of the common good. And we have to, if we're going to be serious about the common good, consider both of those things, not one or the other.
May I clarify on two little points? One is, as I said during my opening remarks, it's not that I'm against all religious exemptions. It's that I think we have to grapple with what it is that religious exemptions do, which is to allow religious people a way out of the law that non-religious people, including non-religious people who have exemptions of who have objections of moral conscience. But the other thing is, it's not that I don't think we can relitigate Obamacare. We can have, as I said, a debate about that. My worry is that, if the president of Eden Foods, claims he's religious, he can get a workaround so he doesn't have to pay for the contraceptives. But if it's just, he doesn't believe in this, but he doesn't offer a religious objection, then he doesn't. And my worry is there that the exemptions are being misused. Not that we can't go back to the justification for the law in the first place.
Why is there a worry that it's a religious get-out-of-the-law free card for the Little Sisters of the Poor, but not for the peyote ingesting Native Americans? Because you only express that worry when it comes to an issue of sex, whether it's contraception, abortion, sex reassignment, or the redefinition of marriage. You don't raise that concern with the Native American ingestion of peyote.
That's false. I actually do it in the book. I say that if peyote isn't dangerous, anybody should be able to smoke peyote. I should be able to ingest peyote. You don't smoke peyote. It just goes to show I don't actually do this. But anybody should be able to ingest peyote. You shouldn't have to be a Native American in order to do this if peyote is not really dangerous, if it's just like alcohol in the case of Prohibition or so on. Same thing for Prohibition. We had the exemption for communion wine, but I think everybody should be able to drink wine, not just Catholics or Christians.
But now you're changing what you said here. What you said today was that you thought the outcome of the legislature was good, was that they kept the prohibition on peyote and they accommodated the religious objector.
I think
that's what I'm highlighting, because I don't think we should be Kantians. I think if your philosophy of law is that a law needs to be universal and exceptionless, you have a bad philosophy of law. Because many laws are going to serve the majority of citizens really well, but are going to uniquely burden a minority of citizens. So think about, we have laws that say every moving vehicle on the road needs to have an electric red brake light. But that doesn't work for the Amish. And so we don't say if the law is good enough for the rest of us, it needs to be good enough for the Amish, you don't get a religious get-out-of-law-free card. What we said was, you can put a triangular red reflective device on your buggy, and that way when the car behind you has headlights, it'll reflect and safety will be served. There were some Amish who refused to even put the red reflective triangular thing on their buggy, and we said, look, we can't accommodate you then. There isn't a way to protect motor vehicle safety if you don't put this on, but we're not going to force you to have the taillight. So I just think we should try to find these win-win outcomes, and it's not a form of privilege or get out of the law free, unless you have an overly Kantian. I know John's not a Kantian, that's why I want to flag it, because I think it's a mistake to have too rigid a conception of the law.
Sure. So I'll take as a friendly amendment. I thought that what the legislature did in Oregon was better than before by allowing people like Smith. I think it would be better still to just get rid of that law in the first place. As far as the Amish buggy thing, Ryan is right that there are some Amish who won't even put the reflector on, but the reflector itself gives me concerns. If you are driving along at a normal rate of speed and you come across this, it's not as good as a light that lights up. And if you, or if one of us has a tail light that's out and we say, well, I'm just going to put reflective tape on it, that's not good enough. So, you know, I think that if the Amish really refuse to put lights on the back of their vehicles and they want to share the same roads with everybody else, roads that are paid for by all the taxpayers, they should just drive during the daytime, not when it's dark, because it's dangerous for everyone.
The woman in the denim jacket.
Hello. Okay.
Hello.
My name is Sienna Greenwell. I'm a freshman here at GW. So in both of your talks, except for a few examples, you discuss cases that mostly deal with Christianity and American Christians. What would you say to the idea that America is essentially a Christian nation, even if we say that it's freedom for all religions, and that these so-called puritanical mistakes are really just backlash to a country that is slowly becoming more secular?
So my general thought is that the United States is a melting pot nation, and so that it's definitely had Judeo-Christian influences, but it's also had Enlightenment influences, it's had common law influences, ancient influences, and so I think it's a mistake to say that it's a Christian nation. And that therefore we should be, you know, a lot of the examples we used were with Christian plaintiffs, but we discuss in the book the ability of Islamic prisoners, Muslim inmates, to be able to grow short beards for devotional purposes, Jewish inmates to be able to eat kosher meals, Sikhs to be able to wear a turban and still serve in the military, and to be able to carry a kirpan, which is a small ceremonial dagger, and not be excluded from civil service. I think both of us agree here is that religious liberty should not prefer certain religions over other religions. It needs to be the same standard that's being applied. And what that standard looks like on hard-to-place cases, the ones we disagree about, it shouldn't therefore say that, you know, the Anglican gets better treatment than the Muslim and the Anglican. And that's why I think we agree here on some of the mosque cases. There have been various small towns that have tried to prevent Muslims from building mosques, where they wouldn't have denied Christians the permit to build a church. And I think that whatever the standard is for building houses of worship should be the same standard, whether it's a church, a synagogue, or a mosque. And I think that's also common ground for us.
That is common ground. Let me say something about the sense in which I think we are a Christian nation and the sense in which we're not. Starting with how we're not. We're a nation that protects, rightly, I think, the freedom of religion and the freedom of people to have no religion at all. The sense in which I think it's important to acknowledge that we are is that historically, Christianity in various forms has been a dominant religion. And the reason I think it's important to acknowledge that is because it's one of those ways in which religion can unwittingly exclude certain people. And I think, I said earlier that I do believe in religious exemptions and religious accommodations in various cases. And perhaps the strongest reason I do believe in that is because religion has been such a site of conflict, not always because people are deliberately trying to harm people who are outsiders to their faith, although that has happened historically, and we both agree that's bad, but also because sometimes unwittingly people forget about people who are not part of the majority tradition. So some of the early important religious liberty cases were about Saturday Sabbath observers. You know, everybody just sort of assumed that you observe the Sabbath on Sunday, and that wasn't working for certain people because they observed the Sabbath on Saturday. An example I like to give, I teach at a large state university. We are expected to give accommodations to students who cannot show up for class or can't take exams because of religious holidays. And at first I thought, well, you know, what's this all about? I mean, I have this large university, lots of different faiths. This is going to be an administrative nightmare. And then I realized, you know what? Christian students never have to take an exam on Christmas Day. It's not because we're a religious school, we're a state school. It's because majority Christian nation, the holidays, and it's now become a secular holiday, and it's interesting. It's a secular holiday based on a Christian holiday, which takes elements from a pagan holiday. Very complicated history.
Or a melting pot.
Well, no, yeah. The point being that I think it's important to acknowledge that tradition if for no other reason than it acknowledges the ways that certain people are excluded from that tradition.
Distinguished gentleman in the back, that's you, Philip Hughes.
Yes, I'm Philip Hughes, and I'm a friend of the Institute, I guess you could say. Certainly a friend of the founder. I'd like to go back to the very first question about markets and liberty, because your answers depended importantly, it seems to me, on examples, for example, drawn from the Old South. But we're not in the Old South. I mean, we've been, you know, like 60, 70 years into the civil rights movement. The idea that going in the direction that our young student friend in front of me suggested would instantly put us back in Jim Crow sounds a little bit far-fetched after nearly 3/4 of a century of working on deliberately progress in the civil rights field. We're now applying some new fields, anti-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. But all the sensitive cases that seem to come up here fall, to my observation, in two big categories, maybe not such big categories. Small private businesses, or, well, Hobby Lobby isn't tiny, but it's still a privately held company, and religious institutions, particularly revolving around Catholicism, but not exclusively. Why it's not possible in a market kind of context to find live and let live solutions here without making everything compulsory is a little bit beyond me. I'd like to see you explore that a little more deeply.
Would you like me to start? Sure. So I guess I believe in the fragility, or I worry about the fragility of these kinds of practices more than you do. I guess I'm not as confident that if we got rid of laws that prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, that there wouldn't be certain towns, I visited some of those towns, there wouldn't be certain towns where people would be excluded from businesses in frequent and widespread ways. I guess part of the reason I'm not convinced of that is that when I look at the places that do not prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, we find cases like the funeral home case that I saw, where it's perfectly legal for that funeral home director to do it, and so he did it. And I think that if we were to get rid of federal anti-discrimination law altogether, we'd have many more such cases, and not just about gay people. But so you and I just may disagree about the likely facts on the ground, number one. Number two, I also think that, for better or for worse, we are in a rather interdependent society. That there are certain rights, responsibilities, privileges that come from business and corporation, and that it's perfectly reasonable for a society to say, look, if you want to incorporate a business and thus be shielded from certain kinds of liability as a result of incorporating that business, we want something from you in return. Namely, we want your business that's open to the public to serve the entire public, or else we're not going to give you that kind of legal protection. And you could say, well, we should just get rid of incorporation too, but then we're talking about a very different world than the world we're in.
So I think especially after the Charlottesville riots and the rise of the alt-right, I'm more sensitive to the prevalence, existence of racism and white supremacy in the U.S. than I probably was before. And that's a moral failure of my own, that I wasn't more sensitive to it prior to Charlottesville. And so as I was looking into this for an amicus brief I was writing, it's still startling, the racial disparities when it comes to employment and housing and education. And I think a significant factor of that, you can't quantify what percentage of that is due to discrimination. That's discrimination that still exists even with these anti-discrimination laws. And so especially when you look at housing, you look at education, employment, income, my fear would be very similar to the John's, that already racial discrimination is taking place even with these laws on the books. You take it off and you have a fragile ecosystem that becomes more fragile. But I don't think either of us was suggesting that if you took them away, we would go back to the 1950s Jim Crow South. I mean, the point there was that the fact pattern on the ground in the 1950s is a very clear example of market failure and the necessity for government regulation. It's now a separate question of whether or not, if the facts on the ground today would justify passing those laws, but it's a different question to ask whether the facts on the ground today justify rescinding those laws. Because I actually think the social message and the social meaning of passing versus rescinding existing protections are different, and they can have different impacts. I'll just mention, I've been discriminated against at least twice on the basis of political affiliation and religious identity. Once a hotel it was booked, I was going to be giving a talk there on behalf of an organization about marriage. When they found out what viewpoint on marriage I would be defending, they canceled the event. Once, John and I were supposed to be speaking at a bookstore in New York City, and even though they already had my bio and it said Heritage Foundation and they had confirmed the event, once they reviewed it a second time and saw Heritage Foundation, they said it wouldn't fit for their bookstore. I didn't press charges either time. I actually think, I'm with you. As much as possible, live and let live. We were able to find a different venue for the marriage talk. John and I have plenty of opportunities to talk about this book. So I think it's also important that we don't use these laws as swords, right? These are meant to be shields. John and I didn't need the protection of this law as a shield. My fear is that when it is used as a sword, it creates those situations that aren't live and let live.
And we agree on that as well, actually.
All this
I
common ground.
think one more question. Yes, please. Yeah.
If I may, I'd like to ask Professor Corvino about two cases involving conscientious objection more generally. The first concerns a debate in medical ethics. Should state physicians who are pro-life, so not, the objection isn't essentially religious, be compelled to perform or participate in the killing of fetuses? And the second question, suppose or consider a case involving a gay baker or florist. Should he be compelled to cater to events with whose central message he disagrees? So this is not a case where a Catholic comes into his shop and he discriminates solely on the basis of his being a Catholic, but the discrimination is against the event itself. And what are the relevant differences between these cases and the ones you talked about? Thank you.
Sure. So I think that the medical ethics cases are among the very hard cases, and I actually acknowledge in my rebuttal to the book that these are very hard cases, and I just say some very quick things about them because it's one of those areas where I actually want to do more study. But I will say, generally speaking, I don't want doctors being told what kind of medical care to give or not to give. But that's a different issue from saying that if you're a doctor who refuses to do certain things, or if you're a pharmacist who refuses to prescribe contraceptives or what have you, whether an employer can say, hey, you know what, we need our pharmacists to be able to do a full range of contraceptives, we need our OBGYNs to be able to perform abortions if needed. So there are different issues here. And what worries me is a lot of the cases involving medical providers are not cases where particular doctors are being asked to act against their conscience, because, with the Hyde Amendment and everything, we're not requiring doctors to perform abortions and nurses to assist in abortions if they don't want to. There are cases where doctors want to be able to perform certain kinds of things, including things like tubal ligations, which are considered routine medical care, but can't in certain hospital systems, even when those hospital systems function as a kind of monopoly in particular towns. And that, to me, is more worrisome. But I want to acknowledge that these are complicated. The gay baker or florist, I'm willing to bite the bullet on a lot of these cases. And so, for example, I had a piece in Slate not long ago. This is coming at it from a different direction than your question, but I'll get back to the direction in which you asked the question. There was a case in Lexington, Kentucky, where a T-shirt shop was asked to do a Lexington Pride T-shirt, and they said, no, that's a message that we don't want to support. And initially, they were found liable for sexual orientation discrimination, eventually went up to the Kentucky Court of Appeals and said, no, this is not sexual orientation discrimination. This is the T-shirt shop not wanting to contribute to a certain message, and that's okay. And I actually wrote a piece in Slate defending the decision and saying they were right. The T-shirt shop should not be forced to make that T-shirt. For the same reason, and I analogize it to this other case, there's a case in Colorado, happened, I don't know, about a year, maybe 2 years, after the Masterpiece cake event, where somebody goes into a Zukar bakery, another Colorado bakery, which is run by an LGBT-friendly baker, and said, hey, I would like a Bible-shaped cake, and on one side I want a picture, like a stick figure of two men with a circle with a line through it, and on the other side I'd like Leviticus 18:22, homosexuality is a detestable sin. Leviticus 18:22 is man shall not lie with man as with women, it's an abomination unto God. That's a lot to put on a cake. So homosexuality is a detestable sin, it's a paraphrase. And what the baker said was, hey, I'll sell you a Bible-shaped cake because I sell those to everybody. I'll even give you an icing bag and you can write whatever you want, but I do not want to write that particular message. Now, in a case where a baker says, look, I'll sell you the same wedding cakes from the same catalog that I sell to other people, but I won't put two men on the top or two women on the top or say, congratulations, John and Mark, I'm going to say, okay, that's fine. Then you're going to say, look, there are particular designs I don't sell, there are particular things I don't sell, just like a kosher bakery doesn't, sell cakes with bacon on top. But this is different. This is a case where they're saying we don't sell the very same items to some people that we sell to other people, and that I object to. So would I force a gay baker or florist to participate in an event that they don't want to participate in? Like, suppose I'm asked to provide cupcakes for the Heritage Foundation, and I've been to the Heritage Foundation, and they serve very nice food there. I'm asked to provide cupcakes for the Heritage Foundation. Now, I don't know if there's a law against discrimination on the basis of political beliefs in D.C.
DC, yeah.
There is? Yeah. Okay, so I would say, yeah, that I should have to follow that law.
So, the question wasn't addressed at me, but I have thoughts that I could offer. Sure. So, what's interesting is that the case John mentioned, the Colorado case that was asked to do the Leviticus Bible-shaped case, there were actually 3 different cases like that, where people against same-sex marriage went to 3 different bakeries and asked them to bake cakes against same-sex marriage. In all 3 cases, the bakeries said no. They then filed a complaint saying this is discrimination on the basis of religion. I asked for a cake that flows out of my religious identity. They said no. And in all 3 cases, the Colorado Commission of Civil Rights said this was not discrimination on the basis of religion. That's exactly what I think they should have said in Jack Phillips' case, that this was not discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. He was not objecting to the sexual orientation of the customers that came to his store. He was objecting to the message and the event that he was asked to help celebrate. So John had said that they didn't discuss design. Every cake that he designed is a custom cake. He doesn't have generic wedding cakes. The other reason he named the shop Masterpiece Cake Shop is because every one of his cakes is a masterpiece of art. About a decade ago, a Colorado paper did a profile of him, and they said it was a gallery of cakes. Some people go to art galleries, galleries of paintings. Here, his cake studio is a gallery of cakes. And so I think it's important how we understand this. We don't use anti-discrimination laws on the basis of religion to force other people to violate their beliefs. So I don't sue Planned Parenthood when they won't hire me because I'm pro-life Catholic. But I think you should be able to sue Planned Parenthood if they don't hire you because you wear a yarmulke. That would be discrimination on the basis of religion. And so we don't use these religion anti-discrimination laws as swords to force Planned Parenthood to undermine its beliefs. We are using these SOGI laws as swords. And I think that's the crux of why this category of anti-discrimination law is much more problematic than other categories.
So you say that there are 3 cases. I'm not familiar with the other 2. I'd like to see them, but I think that you misrepresent the Azucar Bakery case. Marjorie Silva said, I will sell you the cake, I'll even give you the icing rags. She simply decided not to write a certain message, and if that's what Jack Phillips had said,
Jack Phillips
totally defend his case.
Jack Phillips said, I will sell you any other item in my store, but I can't do a custom wedding cake. And so I think those are
It's in the record. He never said custom wedding cake. It's not in the record.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I fear that we are dangerously close to agreement. But the conversation does not have to end. We have some food to offer you, probably not as good as what the Heritage Foundation provides.
Probably not provided by Jack Phillips either.
But before turning you loose to it, I'll ask once more that you join me in thanking John Corvino. And I also want to thank you for your participation in a conversation that I think represents the very highest possibilities of civil debate on controversial